are starting our first our broadcasting program called Freely and Critically. It is the first in English. We have done the series already of such intellectual conversations on political and social issues and geopolitical questions in Lithuanian language, also in Russian. Today we're doing it in English, and our guest is very known, renowned professor who is currently based in Paris, Jacques Rupnik, and our guest Lithuanian professor Gintautas Mažeikis, and me, Tomas Kavaliauskas, from Kaunas University, Vytautas Magnus. We work in Social and Political Critique Center, and needless to say, today during our conversation we would like to talk about various European current challenges, issues, but also we would like to touch theoretical issues, because Professor Rupnik is an expert in sovietology, and he also has made documentary films for the British television. So we have many intellectual colors today to use, and let's start with the questions from Gintautas Mažeikis for Professor Rupnik.
Hello, Jacques. Nice to see you. And I would like you to ask you some questions related to your early period of researches, I would say. And let's go back to Soviet times. In your biography, I found out that you received a master's degree in Soviet studies from Harvard University in 1974. I think our listeners will be interested to know what was discussed in these studies. What was Sovietology like at that time? What was the differences from the scientific communism? And probably you used these studies and experiences for the film making later for British television.
Well, first of all, greetings to both of you and to listeners in Lithuania. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity. And with your first question, you throw me back in the times of a divided Europe and a time of the Soviet period, which was understandably studied in the West. So there were people in the Soviet Union who thought they had a scientific socialism or whatever, some kind of science of how to understand society derived from their crude and sometimes completely misunderstood understanding of Marxism. But there were people in the West, of course, trying to understand the Soviet system, and so I had studied it in Paris. There was a degree at Sciences Po, at the Institute of Political Studies, under Professor Hélène Carrère-Dancause, who was a famous historian of Russia. She's actually, until today, the president of the French Academy. And then I went to study the subject at Harvard. And the main, I think, the interesting thing in looking back is that the whole program, which was chaired by very eminent professors, there was a Professor Adam Ulam, who wrote a great book about Soviet foreign policy called Expansion and Coexistence. And he also wrote a biography of Stalin. There were people, and there were other professors such as Richard Pipes, the historian. Interestingly, both of them, great experts on Russia and the Soviet Union, both of them initially came from Poland. Ulam and Pipes left as as young kids at the beginning of the war and came to United States, did extremely well during their studies and became professors at Harvard. And this is when they started this program. So initially it started the program trying to understand the other side. There was a Cold War, divided Europe. By the time I came to Harvard, this was no longer Cold War, it was détente. In the 1970s, started a new policy initiated by, well, on the Russian side by the Brezhnev leadership, and on the American side by Henry Kissinger, who was then Secretary of State. And the idea basically at the time was the Czechoslovak experiment of 1968 showed certain limits of change in East Central Europe. So, and the invasion of Czechoslovakia in August 68 was meant to show these limits. So the main idea was on both sides to recognize a status quo. Eastern Europe will not get out of the control of the Soviet leadership. The West will not try to do anything in that direction. However, both sides should find a modus vivendi. And that modus vivendi meant the famous three basket of the Helsinki agreements: security, you discuss security, missiles, maneuvers, basically security in a nuclear age. So this was not just an academic question, it was a question of peace in Europe. There was a question of economic interchange. And there was a third element, the so-called third basket, which was basically human rights. It entailed notions such as the freedom to impart information and disseminate information. Okay, so that was a context, recognition of the status quo, and the three baskets, which eventually, because we now know the end of the story, we have seen how the third basket helped to undermine the status quo, helped the dissident movements, the various Helsinki committees and Charter 77 movements, human rights, etc. So that was a context in which I arrived at Harvard, the détente period, in a program that was conceived in the Cold War. So there was a bit of a readjustment there. And I think from what I recall at that period, what I found interesting really there is the interdisciplinary approach. That is, the idea was you want to understand the Soviet system, the way it works in the Soviet Union, but also in East Central Europe. Well, you need to understand the doctrine. Where does it come from? What is it they have in their heads? Basically, the people who have conceived the system and who are running it. So there was that idea. There was the nature of the political system, how it was shaped during the Stalin period in a totalitarian system, you know, where everything was run from the top to the bottom, with a formidable control over everything. I mean, the specific nature of that political system was that it did not allow what Max Weber called autonomy of subsystem. You don't have autonomy of subsystem. Neither the economy nor culture or anything has autonomy. So this is what makes the communist system, the Soviet system of that time, different from other types of dictatorships. It's not just the level of violence. By the time you were in 1960 or 1970, the level of violence, let's say in Czechoslovakia, which was occupied by Soviet troops, was less than the violence exercised by General Pinochet in Chile in cracking down on his opposition. So it's not measured by the level of violence or repression. It's measured by this ambition of total control. And what basically, so that was about the political system, how it changed after Stalin's death, basically since Khrushchev and through the 60s, from, let's say, ambition of total control, terror, and mobilization towards a system which admitted a degree of accommodation with society and relied on other tools of social control. So that was the first thing, the political system. Then you had economy, how the economic system was introduced, how it performed in apparently remarkably well with incredible growth rates of the Stalinist period, the coal and steel period, and how it did eventually went to stagnation and decline. By the time I was at Harvard in the 1970s, the system was in economic stagnation, and later it went into decline. This is actually why Gorbachev had to eventually introduce perestroika, because the system economically was not working. And then there was, of course, knowledge of history, of the culture, the society, understanding the society. And that, I think, was very valuable as an approach. Not just, you don't do just political science or economics or society. You do an interdisciplinary program trying to understand the specific nature of the Soviet system. And well, for whatever it's worth, I think it produced some interesting results.
So thank you for the introduction into sovietology, and let's go further. And later, you was an executive director of the International Commission for the Balkans and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And you prepared the report with the title, quote, "Unfinished Peace," end quote. What does unfinished peace mean in Kosovo? Because you've been in Kosovo and other Balkan countries. What does unfinished peace mean in Kosovo? And could you compare the situation in Abkhazia, North Ossetia, Transnistria in Moldova, or in Donbass in Ukraine in our days? What does mean this unfinished peace?
Well, this is...
Jacques, please, let's try to return to the other events late after collapse of Soviet Union. And you've been executive director of the International Commission for the Balkans, and as well the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And you prepared the report with the title, quote, "Unfinished Peace," end quote. What does unfinished peace mean in Kosovo, in Balkans? And could you compare the situation with the situation in Abkhazia, North Ossetia, Transnistria in Moldova, or in Donbass in Ukraine? Maybe Kremlin, Russia start to use the same concept or the same possibility for the development of unfinished peace situations and to use them. What was your interpretation? What is the unfinished peace?
Okay, well, this, of course, is in the context of the 1990s, when we at first celebrated the return of democracy, freedom in Central Europe, but this is sometimes neglected in the sort of somehow simplified accounts of what happened after 1989. There was a darker side of post-89, and that was the start of the war in former Yugoslavia, the wars of dissolution in Yugoslavia. And, maybe this was not fully understood, let's say, in the former Soviet Union, but Yugoslavia, at least on paper, for most specialists, looked like the best prepared candidate for a transformation. They already had an open economy, people had free passports, they traveled around Europe, and their political system was much more flexible than anything else that existed in Eastern Europe. So on paper, they looked like the best prepared for a transition. They turned out to be the worst calamity, because they plunged into nationalist warfare in the breakup of Yugoslavia. You had a breakup of Soviet Union non-violently, while they had a breakup of Yugoslavia in a violent manner. And therefore, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace established an international commission, of which they asked me to be the executive director, to try to investigate the sources of the conflict and the kind of remedies or recommendations that we could make to the international community. The commission was established in the spring of '95. There was still war then, so we didn't know that the end would be close. But that was interesting because it followed. Why did they have this idea? Because in 1913, when there were the first Balkan Wars, they also had Carnegie Endowment had created an international commission chaired by a French senator, le Baron d'Estournel de Constant, and they produced in the spring of 1914, or late spring 1914, a report on the Balkans, on the wars in the Balkans and what should be done. But of course, by the time they produced the report, it was a bit late because World War I was starting in the Balkans. It is in Sarajevo where the Archduke Ferdinand was shot, and this was a trigger for World War I. And this is the reason why when war came to Sarajevo again in the early 1990s, Carnegie Endowment thought this is a matter for European peace. And this is why they created this commission with a very distinguished group of figures, of political figures. We were the chair of our commission was the Belgian Prime Minister, Leo Tindemans. We had Simone Veil, the French former Minister of Justice, President of European Parliament, Bronislaw Geremek, the Polish Foreign Minister. We had a very, very distinguished group of people there. And I was in charge of traveling with them around the Balkans for 1 year. And we visited all the countries and we spoke to everybody. We spoke to everybody, including people who were in power, Tudjman, Milosevic, who was then ruling Serbia, and all these people, and also people from the opposition. And so we were trying to understand the sources of the conflict and then make assessment and recommendation of what should be done. The reason we have called our report Unfinished Peace is because by the time we have, of course, drafted it in the spring of '96, we had already end of conflict. It was not yet fully peace. Let's say it was end of war, which was imposed by the airstrikes over Bosnia, which forced the Bosnian Serbs then to stop the onslaught on the rest of the country. But why did we call it unfinished peace is that the fact that you no longer have fighting doesn't necessarily mean you really have peace. And you are in an in-between situation, and Bosnia, which was the object, our main object of inquiry, later we have also studied Kosovo, and I was part of another commission, an international commission on Kosovo, which was chaired by Justice Richard Goldstone, a very prominent judge on the South African Constitutional Court, and the first president of the International War Crimes Tribunal for former Yugoslavia. Why unfinished peace? Well, because you establish peace on the division of the country, right? What is the Dayton Agreement, which Richard Holbrooke, the American diplomat, negotiated in Dayton on the military base in Dayton, Ohio, where he brought all the warring parties, was you establish peace on separation. You have Republika Srpska, the Serbs on one hand, Croat Muslim Federation on the other. And you draw a line and you say, well, you have to find arrangements for peaceful relations, but it is peace through separation. And this is why we thought this is great because this is no longer war. and over 100,000 dead in Bosnia, several million refugees. Of course, stopping a war is no small achievement. It's a great achievement, but that doesn't necessarily create peace in a true meaning of the word and the possibility of reintegration in society. So what we try to assess was precisely that, under which conditions you could recreate a state in Bosnia under international supervision. To put it in political science terms, can you have nation-state building under protectorate? You have an international protectorate which has imposed peace, but can that protectorate, which is meant for security reasons, can it create the conditions for a functioning state and a functioning democracy? These are two very different things. And I think on the whole, if we look at the situation, we could say, well, it has certainly been successful on the first part. It has stopped conflict, and you haven't had a violent conflict in Bosnia for the last quarter of a century. So this is an achievement of sorts. On the other hand, can you say this is a functioning state? Well, not really. You still have two separate parts of the country. They all run each other. They have a multiplicity of cross-cutting, overlapping institutions which paralyze everything. You have in the constitution a clause which says that when each of the three parties concerned, you had the Serbs, the Croats, and the Bosnian Muslims, the Bosniak, if any of them consider that their vital interests are threatened, they can impose their veto power on a legislation. On an average year, it is used over 200 times. It means practically every other day it is used. So you have total paralysis of government. So you have a divided country which is not functioning, and you cannot really call it it's not a functioning state. And therefore, the concern is, can the international protectorate withdraw? Because the goal of the protectorate, of course, the international protectorate that imposed peace, is to leave. It's not a neo-colonial venture that you want to run Bosnia. Nobody wants to run Bosnia. There is nothing there. There's absolutely no, you don't derive one penny out of it. It costs an enormous amount of money. So you want to get out. And indeed, I would say, and this applies for Kosovo as well, because you had a similar situation in Kosovo, a military intervention puts an end to the conflict, and then you work trying to create an institution.
Jacques, may I a little bit interrupt, because I think that there we could turn to the other part of question to, this Russian policy to development of such kind of unfinished peace. But before it, I would like to add, because I've been in this year, I traveled in this year in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I visited many of cities as well, discussed with many of Serbs, Croatians, and Bosniaks, and yes, I agree with you, but I would add that many of them, especially Croats and Serbs, they call this state as a failed state. Yeah. That Bosnia and Herzegovina is failed state, and even they couldn't establish canton system like in Switzerland. That is more difficult for them. And, I think that Russia would like to develop the same sort of failed states around the borders of Russia. What do you think about it?
Well, I think that, first of all, it is true that you can call it a failed state or failing state simply because even though you don't have a war, you don't have a collapse, it is simply sustained, propped up under international supervision. So in this respect, you don't have a functioning of state institution. So in this respect, it is a failed state. And also, you have this partition, and we have seen Dodik, the leader of Republika Srpska, say, well, actually, we are considering separation from Bosnia-Herzegovina, by which he means we could attach ourselves to Serbia. And therefore, that means you are redrawing the borders, new conflicts can start, etc. Why is this deserves a parallel with Russia? Is because on the periphery of Russia, in a number of the post-Soviet republics, you have enclaves. They're not, which can compare, let's say, to what Republika Srpska is for Serbia. And I don't know, in Moldova, you have Transnistria. Transnistria is a separate region. It is administered separately. And they even had a referendum on being attached to Russia, although it has never been implemented. Not even the Russians bothered to implement it, which is, but it is there just in case you needed it. And you have in Georgia, you have Ossetia and South Ossetia and Abkhazia. You have enclaves there, which can be used as a lever by Russia on, let's say, Georgia. And you have similar enclaves everywhere. I mean, you have seen recently the conflict in Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And one could go country by country. You have these enclaves. Where do they come from? Well, from the breakup of the Russian Empire, when the Soviet leadership, the new revolutionary Soviet leadership, first they said we finish with empire, then they said no, empire is not so bad, because if the empire is Soviet and socialist, well, then we bring progress to all the oppressed people, so they would be delighted to be part of the empire because they would be heading a speedier way to socialism. So and who was in charge of the policy and who draw the borders? A certain communist Bolshevik leader called Djugashvili, alias Stalin. He was in charge of the nationalities policy. That was his specialty. Even when the Bolshevik party before the revolution, that was his specialty. He wrote even a little brochure. It's probably the only thing he has written really himself. It's the brochure about nationality policy. So, and he, being Georgian, knew exactly what he was doing when he was creating these enclaves. He knew exactly what it meant to create such enclaves. Indeed, they have been put to good use, so to speak, in various occasions. And you can, of course, see parallels between the situation in the Balkans and the situation, let's say, in the Caucasus. I sometimes have compared the breakup of the Soviet Union and the breakup of Yugoslavia, and my parallel would go something like that. You have a breakup and you have a parallel between Russia and Serbia. They are the two strongest component of the multinational state. Then you have the key relationship. For Russia, it was Ukraine. For Serbia, it is Croatia. Historically, Yugoslavia was born from the Yugoslav ID, from the partnership of Serbs and Croats, that they have a shared language, etc., etc. That was the 19th century ID. So when you have the breakup, I would say Slovenia, small, Western, prosperous, heading out, a bit like the Baltic countries, let's say. My parallel is Slovenia and Baltic countries. Croatia parallel with Ukraine, the key partner for Serbia or for Russia. And that's why the war has started there in former Yugoslavia. And the third parallel would be Kosovo and Caucasus. where you have Christians and Muslims, and you have these enclaves that we have been talking about, which in the literature on the subject, they are called the frozen conflicts. So they are frozen conflicts because of the map that I have mentioned derived from the old days. And they are frozen, but they can be unfrozen sometimes, sometimes deliberately, when the policy of the former imperial power thinks that this may be a useful tool. So yeah, that is the parallel we have. And it's not a very encouraging parallel because, and one shouldn't push it too hard because, of course, the big difference between the two is that the Balkans, they are on the European continent and directly, let's say, confronted with the European engagement there, which is not the case with other parts of the former Soviet Union. So, of course, the parallel should stop there.
Jacques, look, in order to finish this part of questions, I just remember that Russia in many cases follow Western rhetorics of Western countries. And for example, Russian use the same tactics of unfinished peace and Western countries. Or for example, Western countries in the United States developed the concept of peace enforcement. Peace enforcement in First Gulf War, and later the concept of peace enforcement was used in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo after collapse of Yugoslavia, you know. And then Russia, Putin started to use the same concept of peace enforcement, you know, in Abkhazia, Ossetia, or in Ukraine. It means peace enforcement. And then Russia said that when Russia was accused for these aggressive actions, Putin and his followers say that you play double game. You know, you look, you do the unfinished peace and peace enforcement, and we're doing the same peace enforcement. You know, we're looking for peace and for harmony and cosmos in the case of chaos. You know, we would like to establish harmony and orders in the places of chaos. Why do you accuse us? You know. And this is the problem to explain for many of audiences, especially in Baltic countries, what was difference between the one piece of enforcement and the another piece of enforcement. Could you explain it?
Well, you know, it's a huge subject. Indeed, the whole, well, peace, you have peace enforcement and you have peacekeeping, and you could add peacemaking, and which implies intervention. And indeed, the debate of the 1990s, you have a war going on in Bosnia, let's say, and later in Kosovo, and you have one side has an army and the other side doesn't, or is trying to find some means to oppose, but it does not have. This was the case of the Croats and Bosniaks in Bosnia. You know, on one hand you had people like Ratko Mladic, who was a general in the Serbian army, and the others were, you know, poorly equipped fighters. So the idea was that foreign intervention, and this is tricky because, of course, you need in principle an international a UN mandate for that to intervene. So you have the question of intervention to stop a war. When the idea that when civilians are in danger, when a government a regime is threatening its own population, you have a kind of duty of humanitarian intervention. That was, I'm not saying this, I'm not defending everything, but I'm just saying this was the argument then, okay? Intervention. you have then, once you stop the conflict, like after Dayton, you have enforcement and peacekeeping. You're trying to preserve the peace, which could unravel at any moment. And that means depriving of the warring parties of the means to fight war. And it means ensuring an international presence. In Bosnia, for long, it was the Blue Helmets, the United Nations troops, and they were stationed in parts of Croatia, in Bosnia, etc. So that was, let's say, peacekeeping after the. So the idea is peacekeeping or peace enforcement after a conflict. I mean, the whole debate about the use of force is very interesting. I mean, if somebody is interested in the subject, for the Balkans, the best book is that written by Richard Holbrooke himself. Richard Holbrooke was a diplomat who actually masterminded the Dayton Agreement. So you can, and I hear it often criticized for all sorts of reasons, but the first merit was to bring all the warring parties in one place, and you say, you're not going to leave this military base in Ohio until you find an agreement to stop the war. And in fact, the book, Holbrooke's book, is called To End a War. So when people say, oh, but Bosnia is not working as a democratic, liberal democracy, no, this was an agreement to stop a war. The Dayton Constitution, based on the separation of the two parts, is to stop a war. Nothing prevents you after to change that constitution and making it a workable, liberal democracy. But in Holbrooke's book, you have that interconnection between three things. One is diplomacy. The second is law, international law. And the third is what he calls a credible threat of the use of force. That is, sometimes you don't have to use the force, but the other side must understand that if they do not go into this agreement, there may be consequences. And I think this is what Milosevic understood after the strikes in Bosnia in the summer of 1995, that the best thing was to cut a deal, and creating Republika Srpska was the best deal he could do for the Bosnian Serbs, and that in that way he was preserving his own regime. But this interplay between diplomacy, law, international law, and the question of the use or not of a force, the credible threat of the use of force. I remember that formula because that is it. It's not just, oh, maybe we will do. No, you must have the other side understand that this is serious. And after the strikes in Bosnia in summer 95, they knew it was serious. It was credible. And so that's the key thing. You want to have a seminar on peacemaking or something like that, or peace enforcement? Well, this is a good book to start with. Can this be used or misused by others in different circumstances? Certainly, certainly, because and I've been talking about Bosnia, but the main precedent that is often referred to by the Russian authorities is Kosovo. Because in the case of Kosovo, yes, you had a sort of ethnic cleansing proceeding in Kosovo, but you have a territory that was formerly part of Serbia, that was in a way, through military intervention and an international protectorate, separated from Serbia. And eventually, 10 years after, led to creation of an independent state. And this is the precedent that the Russian authorities are often invoking. Well, you have done that in Serbia They forget to say under what circumstances, because Milosevic was abusing his military power in Kosovo, which created a kind of apartheid situation there. But anyway, they're using this precedent to say, well, if you have been able to do that with Kosovo, why shouldn't we do something similar in other circumstances and detach, for instance, Crimea from Ukraine? This is the argument. This is the argument used, and so this is why what is interesting from the point of view of studying international affairs, that you must know that each case, each intervention of the international community or part of the international community in some place, let's say the Balkans, because we were talking about the Balkans, but it could be elsewhere, can be read as a precedent or used as a precedent in an argument by others in other circumstances. And of course you can say, oh, but this is misusing the argument, this is misunderstanding. No. You create, yeah, you detach a territory? Yes. Is it independent, Kosovo? Yes, it is. After a military intervention, you detach? Well, we are doing the same thing, and we're doing it under the argument which is protecting whatever Russian speakers in Transnistria or in Donbass or whatever.
The same argument they used for Abkhazia equally, 100%. They said, look, we are doing in Abkhazia equally the same like you did in Kosovo.
Exactly. Yeah. No. So this is it, you know, in international politics, any solution, any intervention becomes a precedent. Incidentally, any non-intervention becomes not a precedent, but an opportunity for others. For instance, you have the Syrian leader Assad is massacring his population. Okay, he had reached a massacre, let's say, of a couple 100,000 people. There's a question of an international intervention, which was agreed upon, but which was not carried out, partly because President Putin said he will obtain an agreement over non-use of chemical weapons, etc. Well, Obama backed down from intervention, and that becomes a precedent too. Non-intervention opens a space, for, let's say, for Russia to intervene itself, and in an opportunity for Assad to massacre another 200,000, because since those days, another 200, so we are now 400,000 dead in Syria. So this is a vast massacre of civilian population. And so both interventions and non-interventions can be used or misused by competing powers, and the Russian case, since we are talking about Russia, yeah, you can use the Kosovo precedent, you can use intervention as a precedent, or you can use non-intervention in Syria as an opportunity.
And if I may, to join and slightly to shift our conversation towards very current events at the Polish and Lithuanian border with Belarus, we see that the dictator Lukashenko is trying to legitimize his presidency by forcing Western European countries to react, and Angela Merkel even made a phone call. Therefore, how do you see this dictator trying to establish himself and all these challenges at the Polish, Lithuanian, Belarus borders, when we have to protect our borders and European Union borders, yet we have to maintain also liberal values because humans are at the border, and humans are being manipulated, and it's a provocation. So, and there's a confusion now, it seems to be. What is your perspective on this?
Well, it is very interesting to see that migration has become a sore point in European politics, especially since 2015 through the 2015 crisis. I have just been talking about what happened in Syria. Well, the direct consequence of that slaughter in Syria was a massive exodus through Turkey, through the Balkans, into Europe. It was no longer migrants from the Balkans, it was migrating through the Balkans to Central Europe and to Western Europe, to Germany. And this is a time where, for the first time, the Central Europeans dissented from European policy at the time by refusing, not just by establishing the famous Orban fence on the border, but by refusing a collective arrangements by which the migrants would be shared through a system of quotas. The idea that this is a shared responsibility for member states of the European Union, and that depending on your population and your GDP, etc., each country would get its share, so to speak, of a couple 100,000, I think, migrants were to be discussed then. So these were relatively small numbers. The bulk of the migrants had gone to Germany. By then, 1 million migrants had went to Germany. So we are dealing with a legacy of that. And it is interesting to see that this time, it's not a migrant crisis like the one I've just referred to. You have a war in the Middle East. Migrants flee the war through Turkey and the Balkans and come to Europe. Okay, this is a migrant wave or migrant crisis. With Lukashenko, it's something different. It's completely engineered. It's not a migrant country. It's engineered human trafficking. So you go to Syria or Iraq or Lebanon, etc., and you organize charter flights for would-be migrants into Europe. You bring them to Belarus, and then you push them to the Polish border and say, this way to Europe. So they have observed what 2015 migrant wave had divided Europeans. And it recreated in the perceptions of many in the West the idea of a new divide, East and West. To put things very simply, the idea that the Visegrad countries, the East Central European countries, refused to take migrants, which they didn't have anyway. They didn't have a migration wave. And this lack of solidarity created a deep division in Europe. And of course, in the following years, the migrant issue became the dominant theme among populist nationalist politicians in Western Europe. So they understood this is a vulnerable point of the European Union. So you mastermind, you organize this transfer of would-be migrants to Belarus and then to Poland, in order to hit Europe where it is seen by them as to be most vulnerable. Let's divide Europe again on this sensitive issue. This is what Lukashenko tried to do. He thought by that he would, of course, not only pay back Europeans for the sanctions they have imposed on his regime after the hijacking of a plane with a Belarusian opponent of Lukashenko, a flight from Greece to Vilnius. So this was not a flight. So this was international hijacking of a plane, a kidnapping of a political opponent. And then you are surprised that there are some sanctions, and to get back at those who impose the sanctions, you mastermind something like that. So this is a spiral, a quite desperate spiral of a dictator who, I think by now is running out of options, because given where he is now, the only option now he has back to the Russian fold, back to the embrace of Putin. It's the only thing he has left. In the past, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, he was toying with the idea that he wanted to be semi-independent from Russia or something like that. Well, this is all gone. His only option for his regime to survive is to be really a very direct tool of Russian foreign policy.
But I would like to add one question to Tomas' question about these migrants, Ordinary, when we see these migrants on the borders between Belarus and Poland, we see children, kids, women, so unhappy, disaster situation. And all, many of Western medias call you, look, this poor people, humiliation and so on and so on. But then I and some of journalists went to Erbil city. Erbil is one of the major city of Iraqi Kurdish. And Erbil is one of the richest city in this region. If you will check on video maps and so on, you will find that it's much more developed part of country than Belarus, with bigger income, and majority of these refugees came from this part of Iraqi. They are Kurdish for Erbil. Erbil is rich city. You could imagine with huge buildings, contemporary, I would say contemporary and developed autobahns, everything is quite good, and income for one person much bigger, few times, maybe somewhere about 3 times bigger than in Belarus. This is the very strange, a very strange situation. From the other side, Baltic countries and Poland, we accept and many refugees from Ukraine and Belarus, that was completely normally, and nobody discussed about, these issues or challenges for Baltic countries and for Poland, because we accept them. It was quite normally, like in Balkan countries, like in Yugoslavia, collapse time crisis, when many of Croats or Serbs run from Bosnia and Herzegovina and back, all this is all, it was understandable. Could you explain, what do you think, why does this standard position of Western medias, to present these refugees, as some kind of, to present these people as some sort of refugees, but not as some kind of, I don't know, tourist or for what kind, because it's not understandable. It's something different than the classical concept of refugee. They are not refugees. This is what tried Poland and Lithuania to explain. Between them, there are only few of refugees, real refugees. What do you think about this political situation?
Well, I would say 2 things. First of all, nobody leaves if one's country, if one is living in peace in his hometown, why would somebody want to leave? Nobody leaves just for fun and a backpack, leaving everything behind, selling their belongings, whatever they have, and move to another continent, to another place. I don't think anybody does it for fun. The reason people leave is seeking a better life. Maybe it's a delusion. It's a illusion. It's a utopia. You can call it whatever you want. But there is always in migrants this idea you're seeking for yourself. And when you ask them, they all say, "I want a better life for my children." When they're there and they're being interviewed sometimes, and they say, I'm not doing it for myself, etc. I'm in my 40s or whatever, etc. But I'm doing it because I want a better life for my children. So first of all, nobody is doing it for fun. They are not tourists. They are migrants seeking a better life. And it's important to distinguish that indeed from refugees and asylum seekers. Asylum seekers, you are running away from war. So, like I said, in 2000, when there was the migrant wave in 2015, the bulk of that wave came from Syria. They were under war. There are 400,000 dead now in that war within 6 years, and it's not over. And so if you're fleeing, this is why the International Convention on Asylum has been signed in Geneva in 1950 for people who are fleeing either a conflict or a regime. Indeed, it was created, this convention, for refugees fleeing communist countries. It was created at the time when the Cold War was beginning. There were people escaping from Eastern Europe. A number of them have been, in a sort of camps in Austria, in Germany, or wherever, in Italy. And this is why the Geneva Convention on Asylum Seekers has been signed by international community. And it's a major international human right provision that asylum seekers. So it remains important, in my view, to keep the distinction refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants, not because there is a difference in the human dignity of the people. The human dignity is the same. They all seek, so to speak, a better life elsewhere. And they are all human beings that deserve to be treated as such. But the situations are not the same. And from the point of view of asylum seekers, from the Asylum Convention, you cannot just say any economic migrant qualifies for that. So those who argue that, and there are those who argue that, I have colleagues who argue that. They say, this convention, this was created in 1950, times have changed. And by now, the distinction is very difficult because there are climate migrants, there are economic migrants, there are war migrants, there are different kind of migrations, but basically the distinctions no longer hold. And I keep arguing with them, saying, yeah, maybe there are new types of migrations, and maybe we should understand that, but we should still keep that distinction, that specific status of asylum seekers and refugees, because this was a human rights provision. Do you really think seriously that it would help human rights to abolish the distinction between asylum seekers and economic migrants? I don't think so. So for Europeans, this is often in the media, etc. The lines are blurred between the two. The second thing is, of course, the empathy, the humanitarian impulse. You see people in the woods, stranded in the cold with children, etc. You are helping. You see a boat in the Mediterranean. Your duty as a human being is to give him, if he's drowning, you give him your hand. I think this is a kind of moral obligation. Somebody's drowning, you give him a hand. Once you have saved him, of course, if he is entitled to qualify as asylum seeker, etc. You have a duty to save him, but you also may have the right or duty to tell him who you are, to say, welcome from the Syrian hell, you have escaped. This is who we are. You want to live here? This is who we are. And who we are is we believe that there is freedom of expression here. So we might say things in ourselves or in the media that you may or may not like, but this is how we live. We accept it, and you know, you have a disagreement. You don't like caricatures in satirical journal Charlie Hebdo, as we had in France. You don't like them? Take them to court. Take them to court. And they've been to court, and they've lost several times, and they've been given harsh penalties because they've offended this or that institution or person. So this is what you have to learn. You're coming here. This is who we are, and that starts. Pluralism. When we have a difference, we go to court. We believe in equality of men and women. This is not an obvious thing from in the countries where you come from.
No. I'm absolutely on your side, but
I'm just going to finish this because this is a way of, why am I saying this? So, equality of men and women. We believe that since Auschwitz, we believe that anti-Semitism is not acceptable in Europe. And I could go on enumerating, so to speak, the 10 commandments of what is Europe, who we are. So migration is a moral duty to help those who need it. It is also an opportunity, or sometimes a necessity, for us to give an attempt at self-definition. If you are welcoming on a mass scale people from outside and you are trying to say who you are or what are the conditions of the societies we live in, it's an exercise in self-definition. And that exercise is useful for the newcomers, for the migrants. It is also not unimportant for us to redefine. This may less apply to countries of East Central Europe, but it's certainly important in Western Europe, which have become a very multicultural societies. You just walk in our cities. So it is quite important that this idea that yes, you can come welcome people from outside, but you also have an understanding of what holds our society together and what is, and basically that exercise in self-definition is an attempt to define what Europe is.
Yeah, for intellectual entertainment, I would like to add that French philosopher Derrida has written a text called Unconditional Hospitality. I think it's titled Of Hospitality, but his concept about unconditional hospitality is very challenging. I personally fail to take it seriously, but he pushes to the limits the concept of hospitality by calling for unconditional hospitality to the arrivants, to the newcomers, meaning that by saying that please feel in my house just like at home, you even have to give the house, give your place. So he's pushing the concept of hospitality to the very, very limit. The professor of hermeneutics, Kearney, has written work against this Derrida's concept by saying that it is very unpractical because you have to identify the arrivant. The newcomer has to have identification, and that's what we talked, that certain explanation about our society, about our cultural norms and the legal standards, equality, etc., has to be explained. And I'm not sure to what extent European countries, by promoting human rights, at the same time has solid liberalism to defend those our social and political standards that keeps our society together, just like you said, our 10 commandments. So sometimes I see that the policy towards and the attitude towards the migrants is very open without without having a priority of what you very nicely and correctly explained about the understanding what holds our society. How are we going to explain to the newcomers from a different civilization with a completely different culture, how are there instruments to work with them? I'm not talking necessarily about integration, but more about education about our standards. You know.
Well, as I said, this is an old debate. To understand why Europeans have these passionate debates about acceptance of foreigners and hospitality. You know, obviously, you quoted Derrida. I know his book on hospitality. This is a philosophical exercise. You know, a stranger knocks on your door. You don't ask him identity papers. You welcome him. You say, welcome, sit down. You are starving. You are thirsty. First, I give you a bread and water or care. I care for you as a human being. Of course, then comes, you know, if you're going to live in my house, well, then I may have to explain how things work. But yeah, the hospital, the first thing before you see somebody, when you meet somebody, is not to ask his identity paper or his religion or his family background or his checkbook. This comes from a long way in European history. You know, a lot of our European history has been made from various kind of migrations. We cannot go into that, but the way it is often perceived, the prism through which it is understood, relates to at least two experiences. One is the experience of the 1930s and fascism in Germany, Austria, and in eastern part of Europe, which produced exodus, migration. Hannah Arendt has written eloquently about that. And when she was warning about the fact that the first thing to go in the context of migration, she was talking about the 1930s. She herself was a refugee from Nazi Germany. And she said the first thing that goes is the asylum, is the capacity or the will to accept refugees. So that was the first thing. The first victim of migration becomes a human rights provision. And the second thing, I remember she had a formulation that she said, the most terrible thing about what has happened in the reluctance or even repudiation of migration wave that was coming from Europe to America was what she called it, the vague and pervasive hatred that permeates all and everything. She suddenly saw in the society, and I remember this formula, the vague and persistent, the vague and pervasive hatred that permeates all and everything. I feel there is an element of that in our societies today. I'm not saying it is dominant. I feel it is there. and it can be exploited by unscrupulous politicians, and it is, and often it is, of course, including in the country I live in. I can hear that. So that is the reason why the question is seen through that experience as well. It's not, the story doesn't start with Lukashenko yesterday at the Polish border. No, it starts with the tragedies of the 20th century. Then you had the people who were fleeing from communism after the war, and there were many. Viktor Orban builds a fence and doesn't like refugees, but he forgets that in 1956, 200,000 Hungarians were seeking refuge in Austria, in Germany, in the rest of Europe, and they were welcomed in Europe, and they were accepted in Europe. Same thing for Czechs and Slovaks after invasion of August 1968. Same thing about Poles when there was a military coup of Jaruzelski in December 1981. We just had the anniversary, actually, these days. This is the 40th anniversary of Jaruzelski's military coup, and that provoked a wave of migrants, incidentally. And so that was the second wave, so to speak. There was the experience of the 1930s that Hannah Arendt described in her own very powerful way. Then there were the asylum seekers from Eastern Europe, and my God, I spent a lot of my time spent with them and trying to help them, and trying to help not just them, but also the dissident movements in Central Europe with whom they were sometimes connected. So this is why there is particular sensitivity in the human rights community, let's say, on these issues. Now, you may say some of the human rights discourse has gone completely astray and is trying to take a kind of Derrida-type position without having read Derrida. They, of course, haven't read the philosophical arguments going back to Greek philosophy, and they haven't read any of that. No, but they just remember that they read something, hospitality, unconditional hospitality. Okay, so they are on that mode, and therefore abolishing this distinction that I said I do think remains important between asylum seekers and economic migrants. Again, I stress, not on the grounds of their human dignity, which is unquestioned, and which, people seeking better life elsewhere, but we have a duty vis-à-vis some, and we don't have necessarily the same kind of duty or capacity of integration vis-à-vis everybody. There was a French socialist prime minister, Michel Rocard, who said, I remember in the late 80s, he said, Europe cannot absorb all the misery of the world. That's what he said. But he added, but perhaps it should take its share. So we cannot have unlimited, unquestioning.
Jacques,
we can take
may I ask you a Kurdish question, which they ordinarily ask on the border? They say, okay, we are going not to Lithuania, not to Poland. We are going to Germany, The question is, why should they fly to Minsk in order to achieve Germany? Why they don't fly to Germany directly, And if Germany has so big hospitality, why they need to include Belarus, Poland, and Lithuania on the road or in this road? Please send the flights, to Idlib or to Baghdad or to other places, or some in Syria, and all these refugees could fly directly. Why they need walk through swamps, winter times with the children? You could imagine how it looks like, because their purpose is to achieve Berlin. Please organize the flights, direct flights from one place to another place, maybe all the problems will be solved. How do you think about this?
Well, I don't think any such flights will happen, or nor should they be, nor are they desirable. I think this is. There was a specific situation in 2015 where migrants were coming from Syria to Turkey. There are 3.5 million migrants stuck in Turkey. They are stuck there, okay? And there will be more coming from Afghanistan after the American debacle in Kabul. There are already 100,000 on the road. So more are coming, and they will be coming to Turkey. And the EU made a deal with Turkey, including a financial deal, 6 billion euros, to keep them there. So this is not like open bar, anybody walks in. And what Lukashenko has done is, of course, as I said, this is not a migrant crisis. This is human trafficking organized for political purposes vis-à-vis the EU. He has tried it. It hasn't worked. It hasn't worked because in this case, although Europeans have been divided in 2015 about how to respond to the migrant crisis, east-west, so to speak, to simplify things, this has not happened this time. This time, the European Union understood very well what Lukashenko was up to. They also understood that he had the backing of Moscow. And this is why, at the end of the day, Chancellor Merkel and French President Macron called Vladimir Putin to try to fix the problem. So at the end of the day, this is how things are being solved. So this is a different situation from 2015. Europeans are united on the idea that if we have abolished borders inside the European Union, it means we have an external border. And of course, in the past, we were not thinking about what kind of border, how to establish that border. We discovered that the neighborhoods can be hostile neighborhoods, and that that border has somehow to be collectively managed. It's not an obvious thing because borders are matters of sovereignty, but sometimes individual countries, as we have seen with the Greeks in 2015, they said, we are unable to handle it. We have so many islands, we have so many migrants, we cannot handle it. And this is when the idea that you have to have a European endeavor in this. This is why Frontex was created, a European agency to handle the protection of the external border. So I think this is, Europe reacts always slowly, in a chaotic way, and everybody complains, of course. But at the end of the day, the solution is not for every country in the EU to barricade itself behind barbed wire. We have been through that. We don't want to do that again. But we have to take seriously the idea that the only condition for keeping internal borders within the EU, within Schengen, open, and this is a great achievement, this is a great freedom. Most of the students who may be listening to this cannot even imagine a situation where you needed passports, visas to go to another country, where you were moving, you were stuck at the border for hours before police dogs, etc., checked. Then, okay, so we have abolished borders inside the EU, but that means we have an external border, and we have to collectively decide how to manage that border, under what conditions, with what means, and that means thinking collectively, not unilateral actions, as have been sometimes the case.
I have to thank Professor Rupnik for such a vivid and live, eloquent conversation that we had honor to have it today, and hopefully we will have such intellectual, political discussions in the future. I would like to remind our viewers that this is the program called Freely and Critically, run by Professor Mažeikis and me, Tomas Kavaliauskas, from Kaunas Vytautas Magnus University, Social and Political Critique Center. Once again, thank you, and hopefully we will meet in the future.
Thank you, Jacques.